Breaking news. How serious is Vladimir Putin's predicament, really? What we've learned about Putin in recent days, and what the attempted mutiny could mean for Russia and the West, according to 14 Russia experts. It's been a few days of strangeness, confusion, and anxiety. The world watched as a rift opened up among some of Russian President Vladimir Putin's most trusted aides, and one of them began firing on domestic targets. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the mercenary Wagner Group, who refused to have his forces integrated into the Russian army and sent them into Russia to confront the military leadership, has been offered exile, which appears to have resolved the situation for the time being. The short and long-term effects of this show of defiance on Putin and the autocratic regime he has spent the last 23 years erecting remain to be seen. We asked some experts on Russia and its leader for their take on the recent developments and what they might portend for the future of Russia and its relationship with the West. While some fear this as the beginning of the end of Putin's rule, others believe he can use this incident to further solidify his position in power. There is concern that the conflict in Ukraine will escalate and that there will be bitter infighting among Russian elites in the future. The fact that Putin and Prigozhin may have had other motives for their agreement complicates matters further. What they said is as follows. Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, NSC Senior Director for Europe and Eurasia, and Ambassador to Poland Daniel Fried. In just the past 2 days, we have seen evidence that Putin's grip on power is flimsy and that the Russian state is in disrepair. So don't expect Putin to resign tomorrow. Putin, however, was forced into negotiations after a military revolt. It appears that Prigozhin either had tacit support in a lot of places or that a lot of people in the Russian system didn't care enough to exert themselves to stop Prigozhin and his small force from seizing the city of Rostov-on-Don and driving on Moscow. Putin himself used 1917 as a comparison. Imagining himself as Tsar Nicholas II was a bad idea, but apt, since the latter presided over a war that was lost due to incompetent leadership. Putin is, too. By 1917, Russia's government had grown enormous but empty. Now that Russians and Putin's friends and foes around the world can see that Putinism is synonymous with chaos and a failing war, the onus is on Putin to prove otherwise. Putin may have trouble rising to that challenge. Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, where she also serves as the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Russia Resurrected. Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order, 2021, is her most recent work. The strange conclusion to Prigozhin's 36-hour mutiny against the Russian military leadership is still shrouded in mystery. Many analysts have already jumped to the conclusion that this incident has dealt a fatal blow to Putin's regime, but we must be careful not to make that assumption. All it has done is prove what any Russia expert already knew. Putin is not invincible and all-powerful. Russian politics are real. There is internal strife in the country, and elites sometimes engage in deadly turf battles. Due to the fact that high politics under Putin is a game of personal loyalties rather than of institutions, we just saw some of this spill rather crudely into the open. Putinism is a bit of a house of cards. He apparently used Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov as pawns in order to encourage the Russian armed forces to press on with their poorly planned, special military operation, in Ukraine. Putin overestimated his ability to rein in the monster he had created, but Prigozhin went a little too far. His mafia-like rule of Russia led to a brief uprising. There are 3 things that stand out about this incident. Firstly, the Wagnerites' rapid advancement to within 200 kilometers of Moscow and their ease of seizing a major Russian city, Rostov-on-Don, suggests they may have been picking up followers from regular Russian military units as they went. Second, that would clarify Putin's address to the Russian people, in which he seemed to be preparing the country for civil war rather than assuring his fellow citizens that this was just a mutiny by a ragtag bunch of mercenaries. He appeared to be genuinely terrified. Putin has carefully cultivated an image of absolute power through his monopolization of Russian media, but this development undermines that narrative. However, this does not point to a significant challenge to his authority. Third, instead of being sent to a labor camp in Siberia and his mercenaries returning to barracks, Prigozhin went into exile in Belarus, a Russian vassal state. Why? We still don't know what he was promised, but knowing that Putin doesn't forget or forgive traitors, think back to the poisoning of former KGB spy Sergei Skripal in the UK a few years ago, means that Prigozhin is probably losing sleep over it in Minsk. This incident, however, serves as a cautionary tale that Putin is formidable but fallible. He temporarily lost control of one of his clients due to the conflict in Ukraine. The other takeaway is that Putin has shown that he is more concerned with suppressing internal dissent and rebellion than he is with containing NATO and so-called neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And rightly so. Senior fellow Nikolai Sakov works at the Vienna International Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation. I'm not sure how much more we learned about Putin and his future. This was not a coup, and probably wasn't even a mutiny, it was Prigozhin's adventure. Putin labeled it as such, but Prigozhin said nothing critical of Putin during the entire conversation. His main target was the Moscow generals, specifically Shoigu and Gerasimov, but also others. Putin took the side of the armed forces and ordered that all paramilitary organizations be folded into the regular military. Except for Wagner, there was unanimous agreement. Wagner's response indicated that he viewed Putin as the ultimate arbiter, despite rumors that the military intended to use force against Wagner and arrest Prigozhin. The war will not be affected, in my opinion. Putin and his regime will not be weakened by this, in my opinion. The generals and officers on the front lines, especially, may give him more support than higher-ranking officials like Shoigu. Remember that General Sergei Surovikin, perhaps the most popular general right now, criticized Prigozhin for risking a civil war in the midst of a war with external adversaries. His attitude is the same as Putin's. I have a sneaking suspicion that the events of June 24 helped ease some of the mounting tensions in the Russian political system. However, I would not rule out a major reorganization of the current leadership, which has shown pretty poor performance over the past year and a half, just as Prigozhin hoped. Putin's standing in the military might improve if this happens. Rajan Menon oversees Defense Priorities Grand Strategy Program. Russia's military and security forces were caught off guard as evidenced by the Prigozhin saga when the Wagner Group invaded Russia from Ukraine, captured Rostov, and looted the 58th Combined Army's headquarters without encountering significant resistance. Amazingly, Prigozhin and his armed entourage were able to make their way up the M4 highway toward Moscow via the provinces of Voronezh and Lipetsk. Unrest in the Russian government. Two top generals pleaded with Wagner's troops to put down their weapons. Highways of critical importance were shut down. To silence Prigozhin, the internet was censored in some areas. In Moscow, security was increased dramatically. There was some panic buying amongst the Russians. Putin had to reassure his people that the uprising, which he likened to the 1917 revolution that toppled the Tsar, a statement in itself about how seriously he took the threat, would be put down. A remarkable series of occurrences, all told. One thing is certain at the moment. Putin's efforts over the past 2 decades to portray himself as invincible have backfired. Even though Putin had publicly accused Prigozhin of treason, the crisis was diffused only after he cut a deal, the terms of which we do not know, with him, with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko playing mediator. Furthermore, Putin had to rely on the forces of one warlord, the Chechen strongman Ramzan Kadyrov, to help defeat the forces of another, Prigozhin. Putin's spin doctors will no doubt say that he handled the crisis with cool decisiveness. 3 things, however, cannot be denied. The government was shaken to its core, caught off guard, and ill-prepared. A state's first responsibility is to ensure the safety of its own citizens. The Russian government's preparedness and ability on that front have come into question in recent days. Will its flaws serve as an invitation to future dissenters? Putin has probably thought about it, but we will never know. It is also unclear how the Wagner Group's presumed dissolution will affect the conflict in Ukraine. Overall, Wagner forces have been more effective than regular Russian forces.